Energy Media readers, today we're going to be talking about Alberta's orphan well problem, and it's big and potentially getting much bigger. And so we'd like to welcome Grant Bishop. He's an economist with the C.D. Howe Institute, and he's going to be talking about an op-ed that he wrote in the Globe and Mail recently about this topic. So Grant, welcome to the interview.
Thanks for having me, Markham.
Now, Grant, I'm going to frame the question like this. I did a column a little while ago about a December 19 study that was put out by the Alberta Securities Commission, the Oil and Gas Review, and it showed that in 2016, public oil and gas companies in Alberta raised $16 billion, and that was at the depth of the recession. And last year in 2019, they raised $1 billion. And that, I think, kind of illustrates the way in which financing and access to capital has essentially collapsed for the juniors and for some of the intermediates. And that leads us into the question of we have companies that are failing, then that creates what creates the orphan wells, the wells that need to be reclaimed and remediated, but no longer have an owner. And now you wrote about that. Can you give us an overview of your argument?
We did. And I mean, there of course is a perfect storm now of challenges for the oil and gas sector broadly, but particularly juniors, at the same time that we are faced with a historic set of liabilities for abandoned wells and potentially a wave that would come where we're shaky firms to become insolvent. The problem is that we haven't had in the past adequate financial security for the liabilities that companies have in their abandoned wells, the cleanup that will be required if they go insolvent. The ultimate inheritor of those will be the public, and there will not be security, there won't be collateral to fill the cost burden of doing remediation.
I want to jump in here, Grant, because there's been, and you dealt with this a little bit in your op-ed, there's been some allegations of shady dealings by companies so that bigger companies offload old wells that onto smaller companies, and maybe sometimes even shell companies, it's been alleged, that then take over these liabilities. The shell company or the small company goes bankrupt, and really, that is not cricket. I mean, essentially, the companies that should have had those obligations escape them by finding a loophole. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and there are some transactions that have recently become flashpoints. Our point in the op-ed was not to make a call on the validity of those transactions or matters that are before the court in the case of Sequoia. The point was to point out that there is an incentive for cream skimming or dregs dumping. Many ways the Redwater decision dealt with the potential for cream skimming from insolvent entities, taking the good assets out while and transferring them for value, while the bad assets stayed with the insolvent entity and therefore were imposed on the public. Redwater, the decision, was all about the regulator, the Alberta Energy Regulator, being able to impose orders to attach conditions to the transfer of any licenses that required the cleanup of any bad licenses or any bad wells left with the insolvent entity that you couldn't cream skim. I mean, I think there is a sort of flip side reciprocal risk in that kind of dregs dumping that we spoke about, that certain transactions could reflect, where you are taking assets that are bad and putting them into an entity that is not sufficiently capitalized. Our point is that entities still being solvent and trying to transfer those wells out, the regulator has to be scrutinizing those transactions, ensuring that the entity that inherits them has an adequate balance sheet to do the remediation.
Okay, so in your op-ed, did you come up with any specific recommendations for the regulator and for the provincial government to solve this problem?
Yeah, and our recommendations were to ensure that going forward, there is adequate financial security posted by any holder of a license to remediate the the well when it becomes inactive. I mean, the principle here is pretty sound, right? I mean, if you have a potential liability that would fall on the public, you should be posting security to cover it. Our point was, if you require that security but allow a different set of forms to fulfill it, you can leverage the private market to price what the risk of a company going insolvent and then having unremediated wells would be.
Are we talking about liability insurance here? Is that what this is?
We can see it in different forms. I mean, what we used as an example is a letter of credit from a regulated, assured financial institution that was provided on behalf of a well owner as security to the regulator, and the creditor is going to price that accordingly and monitor the producer effectively to ensure that the credit risk is as they think it would be. The point is, if you allow a diversity of forms of financial security, you leverage the private market to provide and price that in an efficient way.
Is there any chance that any scheme that adequately prices liability then adds additional costs to companies that are already financially vulnerable? Many of them have damaged balance sheets from the downturn that never recovered because of the problems since like 2017, last couple 3 years. And is there any danger that the fix actually makes the problem worse?
Yes, and I mean, I think that's where it's a fine balance, and the ramp up of this requirement for financial security has to be done in a way that avoids tipping fragile companies into insolvency. But we're stuck with a situation where we haven't imposed what we should have imposed in the past. We need to grade up into it. Yeah, I mean, in the immediate term, there's the risk that additional requirement forces the small producers that are on the edge of insolvency past the tipping point. In the end, I mean, it's a choice between whether that gets imposed on the public ultimately, or whether we find a way to shift it back to the operators who really should have been bearing it previously, internalizing that cost in their operating model.
I have an opinion that I'd like your opinion on. I think that this is essentially the death knell of the traditional Alberta junior oil and gas sector. I think that there are too many of those companies out there that are financially vulnerable. They're ready to collapse. And I don't mean that we will have zero juniors, but we've already seen, according to the Alberta Securities Commission, that the juniors have gone from 210 reporting issuers down to 89. I mean, it's already 55 or 60% less than it was just 4 years ago. And this seems to be an issue that could weed out still a lot more of those juniors. What's your take?
Well, I mean, I think if you believe in market principles, you should let the market decide once you have priced all the externalities in economic speak. I mean, here there's been a subsidy effectively from the public covering the potential liability of abandoned wells. We advance is that should be priced. Those that reap the return should also pay for the risks, the private or the costs they would otherwise impose on the public. But once you have that priced, I think the view would be let the market decide. And I can't armchair quarterback what would happen to small junior producers. They would figure out how to rationalize costs. Certainly there is a question of economies of scale in our current energy production. Larger particularly oil sands operations have a lower marginal cost of production. But technology is changing the game for producers, and many small producers, if they can innovate their way down to the lower cost portion of the supply curve, they'll be well placed. I mean, I think that's the principle that we should be looking to in our upstream sector, market efficiency, as determining who who produces, not favoring any players by subsidies, explicit or not.
Gotcha. Now, in your op-ed, you briefly mentioned the regime, the liability management regime that's in place for the oil sands, and it's better than the conventional side of things. I know there's been a lot of criticism that it's still not beefy enough to give the public confidence. Nevertheless, there's something there. Is that a model that could be applied to the conventional side?
I mean, the criticism, I mean, in the sense that financial security is posted, this is the good part of the Mine Financial Security program. A flaw in the MFSP is that there's such a high reliance on the value of reserves, and therefore, questions about the sufficiency of that as in the ground collateral for the ultimate cleanup obligation. To the extent that there is financial security at play, skin in the game, or posted collateral to cover the liability, that's a good thing of the MFSP, and what the conventional well problem could take away. I said, though, I think there are some real challenges with the way that the MSSP is structured. The Auditor General pointed to those, and we make the point in the op-ed that although perhaps the design of the program is better, the size of the liability is swamping to even what's in the conventional side, and something that the government needs to get ahead of as well. We're not facing insolvent large mine or mine producers for oil sands in any near future. The entities doing it are well capitalized and strong cash flow, but we need to be, given the length of these projects, looking out further and ensure that the public is covered in 20 years' time.
Grant, that's all the questions I have. Is anything that we should have talked about that we didn't, or final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenging road to hoe for policy makers, and as said, a fine balance in the present commodity environment to ensure that we begin to shift the risk back to those that should be bearing it, but not have the downward spiral, the perverse result of more insolvencies immediately because of where the market is right now.
Grant, thank you very much. We always enjoy chatting with you, and we'll look forward to do more of this. And I'm sure we will be chatting about this issue again. This is going to be, I think, on the front burner for the next couple of years.
Certainly. Thank you, Markham.